All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Bernsen. I'm going to be speaking today to you folks here and also the people on the webcam. I'm an author and historian from the San Antonio area, and this is my presentation on my new book, The Lost War for Texas. All right. So the subtitle of my book is Mexican Rebels, American Birthrights, and the Texas Revolution of 1811. Now, most people are probably saying, 1811, what the heck's he talking about? The revolution was in 1836. What if everything you thought you knew about Texas history was wrong? Or at least half the story. Texas actually had two revolutions, not just one. The first revolution was launched by native Tejanos. It was the native Tejanos in 1811 who launched the first revolution against Spain. And Anglo-Americans joined Tejanos in this revolution and fought alongside them, Anglos and Mexicans as allies 25 years before the Alamo. And this revolution was actually bigger than the revolution of 1836 that we know. Now, what is the Texas Revolution of 1811? I made up this term because there is no name for this war. Oddly enough, it's just kind of been overlooked in history. It's the Mexican War for Independence as it's fought in Texas. So if you know Hidalgo makes the cry for revolution in Mexico in 1810. In Texas, this starts with the Casas Revolt in January 1811. And then 2 months later, the Spanish royalists are going to get power back through what's called the Zambrano coup by a Spanish officer who basically takes back power in San Antonio. This is going to lead to a filibuster in Texas, the Gutierrez-McGee expedition. A little clarification on terms. The filibuster is not something related to the U.S. Senate. That's the term we think of today. But a filibuster in that time period, a filibuster is a Americanization or another word for freebooter. It's basically a mercenary soldier. So it's a mercenary invasion of Texas by Anglo-Americans. This is going to lead to a key event that most people don't even know took place, the Siege of La Bahia. La Bahia, which we know most commonly as Goliad, had a siege there. It was a 98-day siege. That's 7.5 times longer than the Alamo, and it's not in most Texas history books. There's going to be two more major battles. Oh, did I just turn that off? Two more major battles, the Battle of Rosillo and Alazan in March and June of 1813. And then the culminating battle, which if you've heard any part of the story, it's probably this part, the Battle of Medina, August 18th, 1813. This is the largest battle ever fought in Texas. So let's get into the filibuster. This is kind of the core of the story. It's called the Gutierrez-McGee expedition because it's led by two men, Jose Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, who's a Mexican revolutionary, and Augustus McGee, who's a former U.S. Army lieutenant who left the U.S. service and joined the Mexican Revolution. They create what's called the Republican Army of the North. It's called that because it's the North Mexican Republican Army. They're not thinking of themselves as Americans. They're volunteers in the Mexican cause. Initially, this army is only 150 men. It's tiny. And it's almost all entirely Anglo-Americans and then some French Creoles from Louisiana, which has only recently become a state of the United States. Actually, like 2 months before this. So as it goes into Texas, as this army invades into Texas, it's going to add Mexican rebels. As it captures Mexican territory, Mexican rebels are going to join what's actually their cause and fight alongside the Americans as well. And there will be more American volunteers coming in as they have success. Now, this is not the first book about this topic. There have been several books on it in history. There's a couple in the early 20th century, 1939, 1942, and these all share a historical consensus that pretty much every historian has ever come up to, and that's that this is a filibuster organized and promoted by the Madison administration. This is a U.S. government attempt to take over Texas 25 years before ultimately, Americans and then, later on the actual US government take over Texas. That is what all these books have said, except for, oddly enough, the one written by, it's not in here. The one written by, actually this one, written by the editor of the James Madison papers. He looked at it and said, this doesn't make sense. And he's right, because all these historians are wrong. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. This is not to brag or anything. This is to tell you why I look at things different from a traditional historian. I'm not a regular historian. I went out in the military, served in my country after 9/11, served in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the Western Pacific in the US Navy. I served as an intelligence officer. And what I did is I investigated insurgencies. I came back, decided to get my master's degree in Texas history, and started looking at this story. And what I realized is that if you look at the places I served, Iraq, Afghanistan, they share a lot of similarities. All the things that an insurgency needs, they all share commonalities. And that's the same whether you're Iraq, Afghanistan, or Texas in 1812. And knowing what to look for, which most historians were kind of just looking at the big picture, not looking at the smaller features, I know what to look for. There's a few things I know it's got to have. It's got to have organized networks to support it. It's going to have a recruitment network for foreign fighters. It's going to have financial aid, all these kind of things it has to have. So what I did is I started looking at the individuals in the story, not just the big picture, where the battles were and all this kind of thing, but breaking down who these ordinary people were. This is something that the previous historians couldn't do. You couldn't go and take a random frontiersman named, Abner Lane, for example, just take a random name. You can't just do that research and find out a bunch of stuff of him. But what's changed in modern times is digital sources, genealogy, and Google, frankly. There's a lot of things you can do, research you can do that you couldn't have done before. And that led me to other sources, including archival sources that were never discovered before. And so I pieced together all this information over a period of about 5 years. And what I started to realize is there's something more to the story. And so I realized that this narrative that most historians have been putting together is off. Because if the James Madison administration is trying to steal Texas and they're organizing this, they've got to have communications, they've got to have organizations. There's this American special agent on the frontier, a guy named William Shaler. He's supposedly the guy who's organizing it. He's the only person who could. The problem is he's never met his boss, James Monroe. He's just on the frontier, happens to be there. There's all these things that just didn't fit. And so when I looked at it, I realized this guy, William Shaler, can't be doing this on his own. He doesn't have the authority. He doesn't have the background. And one of the reasons most historians had thought he was kind of doing this in a secret plot to steal Texas is because they never found his instruction document. If you work for the State Department as a special agent, you're going across the world, you're doing your job, you have a document that tells you what you're supposed to do. That's diplomatic protocol. And they never found it, so they assumed there was something nefarious or secret, or there was verbal instructions. The problem is they never looked in the right location. It's not in the National Archives. It's in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, where I found it. And what this document says very clearly, and I'm gonna skip through all the verbiage, but it basically says your job is just to establish relations with the Mexican rebels. The reasons are, if you put this in context, this is 1812, actually 1811, 1812 when this is kicking off. War of 1812 is kicking off right before this happens. They're not are disconnected. So the United States realizes there's a worldwide struggle for trade supremacy. The US government is trying to get new markets. They're being shut out of Europe. That's the whole reason why we started the War of 1812. And so they're trying to establish relations with these new Spanish possessions that are starting to break off from the Spanish Empire. And they want to create these connections and hopefully establish trade. So what really happened? If Madison and his people are not behind it, then who is? And that leads us to the Aaron Burr conspiracy. So if you notice in my subtitle of the book, I talk about Burrites. These are followers of Aaron Burr. To remind everyone of the history, it's been a few years since most of us have gone to U.S. history. Aaron Burr is Vice President of the United States. He gets in a duel with Alexander Hamilton. He shoots Hamilton. Hamilton dies. Hamilton gets a musical. He's famous. Burr gets nothing, right? No one writes a musical about Aaron Burr. So what's he going to do? He's going to go to the frontier, and he's going to scheme up a plan to create his own empire. And he works with this scheming American general, a guy named James Wilkinson, who's the master schemer and betrayer. And they come up with this plan to invade Mexico and liberate Mexico. And they're going to be kind of the nominal, or maybe not the nominal rulers, but the actual de facto rulers of Mexico. That's his plan in 1805. It falls apart because Wilkinson, this guy, gets cold feet. And he's betrayed everybody else alive except Aaron Burr, so Aaron Burr is next. So he writes to President, at the time it was President Jefferson, and he says, hey, I heard this terrible conspiracy, and Burr's going to betray you. And he's going to claim that I'm in on it, but I'm not. And so that's what he does, and he betrays Burr. The whole thing collapses. Everybody gets arrested. They try them all for treason, and most of them are found innocent because it never actually kicked off. It got stopped before it actually kicked off, so you can't be hung for something you didn't actually do. So in New Orleans, they're working with a group called the Mexican Association of New Orleans. It's led by this guy named Daniel Clark. And here's their oath. They're not just taking little bits of the Spanish Empire. They're taking the entire thing. Their oath is to use all means and aid and assist in effecting the emancipation of Mexico and Peru. So they're going all the way down. So they have these plans, and the plans come out in the trial on all the testimony. If you read them closely, it basically becomes a mirror of what actually happens. So what I started to realize is the plan in 1806 was not totally thrown away. It was basically shelved. And 6 years later, when the opportunity arrives, Mexico's in rebellion, these people come out of the woodwork and actually implement it. I won't go into too much detail, but I've found lots of these Burrite footprints in the Republican Army. I keep turning that off. General John Adair, who's the commander, supposedly the commander of the Burr Army, is chosen to command this army. He doesn't actually do that, but that was the intention. And 3 of the top 5 Republican Army commanders are recruits to this rebellion. So what actually happened? Well, let's talk a little about the timeline of what happened in this invasion of Texas. Remember, it's a 150-man, tiny army. So the army comes in, invades, takes Nacogdoches without a fight. That's the first town on the way. The Spanish army basically deserts. The troops in Nacogdoches desert. A lot of them join the rebels. So the rebels now have a large Mexican contingent in this Mexican army. So they move down to take the next town, which is a town called Trinidad del Salcedo, which was around where Madisonville, Texas is. It's now gone. It's a victim of this revolution. They're moving down the river. They're aiming at San Antonio. The Royalists are regrouping. They plan an ambush on the Guadalupe River. The rebels find out about it from some spies among the Indians, and they move around the flank of the Royalists and take La Bahia, which we know today as Goliad. And so in November of 1812, the Royalists are going to follow them there and besiege them in the Presidio. This leads to the Siege of La Bahia. This is a 98-day siege. This is a huge event in Texas history most people don't know about. There's little skirmishes all throughout the time period. My favorite is this one called the Battle of the White Cow. That's the few historians who've written about it call it that. Basically, the story is the Spanish army, both sides are starving. This is a 98-day siege. They don't really have great supply lines. The Spanish are trying to butcher a cow, this little white cow, and it escapes. And it runs towards the rebels. And the rebels say, oh, free cow, right? I mean, they're starving too. So they go out there, and the Royalists send out their troops, and the rebels send out their troops, and they have this battle for about 3 or 4 hours over a cow. And something like 150, 200 people die. And yet nobody recorded who got the cow. We still don't know. So the army is trapped in the siege, and it's terrible conditions. Their commander, this Augustus McGee guy, this former American officer, is going to die, most likely of disease. Some people speculate there's something more nefarious, but the evidence points to consumption as the most likely cause. And the guy who's going to take over is a guy named Samuel Kemper, who is one of these Burr conspirators who's joined the cause. And Burr is going to lead them through the last stages of the siege. The climactic battle is February 1810. There's basically two wings of the battle. I won't get into all the details, it's all in the book. But Captain Miguel Menchaca, who's the leading Tejano in the army, is going to lead one wing and defeat the Spanish. And an American guy named Gormley, we don't know his first name, we just know his last name, he's going to lead the other side. And by the way, if you go to the Presidio today, it's a little deceptive. You see the picture, it's in this nice pretty flowers. At the time, the town was right up to it. The town of Goliad, modern Goliad, is north of the river. The town of La Bahia before was south of the river. So it was a house-to-house fight. The rebels actually win this, and the Spanish army is going to have to pull the siege and head back. The reason they do this is because a third contestant has entered this war, and that's the Comanche Indians. And while the entire Spanish Royalist army is in La Bahia fighting the rebels for 98 days, the Comanches realize this is their opportunity to go to town. And they go to town literally in San Antonio. And they go to San Antonio, they raid, they steal, they kill, do terrible things. As we know from the previous revolution of January of the previous war, the previous year, the people of San Antonio are already rebellious. They're going to get really rebellious after they get raided by the Comanches. So the Spanish are going to come back to San Antonio, and they're going to be treated like occupiers in their own city by the locals. They realize they have one last chance. They go out to meet the rebels, try to ambush them again. This is defeated at the Battle of Rosillo. The Royalists are going to be pushed back with terrible losses, 400 killed. And what you're going to see in all the battles of this war is the side that breaks first is going to get wiped out. And the reason is this is not a Mel Gibson movie. You can't load a musket while you're running and turn and fire. It doesn't work that way. Once you turn your back, once you fired your shot, you have to be standing still to load again. Once you've turned your back, they're going to hunt you down. You're going to see that in every battle. So the Republicans defeat the Spanish and they take San Antonio. San Antonio is now free. It's independent, except not really. They're gonna have a Declaration of Independence, the actual first Declaration of Independence in Texas, but also in Mexico. Nowhere in Mexico proper, have they declared independence. Father Hidalgo has not done that. He said he's declared revolution. It's not the same thing. So the rebels in San Antonio declare independence and a constitution in April of 1813. The Constitution specifically says Texas is part of Mexico. There's no word in there about becoming part of the United States or becoming its own country. It says specifically, we're here for the Mexican revolutionary cause, no other. And they make it that very clear. Now, the American soldiers fighting in this army, they have no problem with that because that's why they're there. They're there because they're going to get paid, they're going to get land, they're going to get all these things, and they don't care who the government is. They want those things that they've been promised. What is going to bother them and kind of push the army into a little contention is when the Tejanos take reprisals against the Royalists. They're going to capture and execute 14 Royalist officers, including the governor of Texas and the governor of Nuevo Leon. And this really splits the army. They're still there, they're still in control, but there's a lot of disaffection. This is going to play out because the Spanish are going to come back. Under a general named Elizondo, they come back in June of 1813 with another force. And Elizondo is very clear what he's going to do in San Antonio. He basically says, we're going to reconquer you from the treason of its inhabitants and the English heretics, because the Americans to the Spanish are just English. And he basically says, we're going to destroy the city of San Antonio. He's very clear that it's going to be a terrible reprisal. The problem is, Elizondo knows that the two sides, he's got spies in the city, he knows the two sides are disaffected. He sends a courier to each side. He sends one to the Tejanos and one to the Anglos, and basically says, if you betray the other side, I'll let you go and you'll be fine, and I'll slaughter them. Now, there are enough Anglos and Tejanos or friends who they put these two letters together and say, hey, this is, somebody's being lied to, right? It's probably both of us. So they actually regroup in the middle of the night, march out, and attack him at the Battle of Alazan. If you know San Antonio geography, this is not really the best map, but there's the Alamo, roughly that little black star. We need to find a better color there. This is where the battle was. It's Alazan Creek right here. I'll show you on the next page. The Spanish come in with a slightly larger army. The rebels sneak up and attack them at dawn. It's a surprise attack. The rebels will win. They're going to push the Spanish back, and once the Spanish flee, again, if you're fleeing, you can't escape. And now the rebels have a new ally, many of the Indian tribes of Texas. The Comanches are not so much allied, but the Lipan Apaches and the Alabama Cashadas and a lot of other tribes are allied with this rebel cause because they want the Spanish out. And so it's going to be a terrible slaughter. A lot of the Indian allies will take scalps, including women and children, because the Spanish army has a large number of camp followers. We know about 350 were killed, but who knows, it could have been more. And the Republican losses are pretty small. So it looks like, once again, the Republicans have consolidated Texas. By the way, if you want to know where the battlefield is, this is the map in the National Archives that I found of the battlefield, and this is Alazan Creek. So we know pretty much exactly where it is. It's Sidney Lanier High School, right under there. Now, the Spanish are going to come back one last time, and the reason they are is because Texas is crucial to their strategy and to the rebel strategy. The rebels in Mexico have been fighting for 2 years. They're struggling. They have large numbers of people, but very few weapons, very little money, very little resources, very few trained military people, all things they need from outside. And they don't have a navy, so there's no way to get that except through land. And the only land route to get resources is through Texas. And that's originally why the rebels recruited Gutierrez to go recruit American aid, because they need a land route through Texas, and they want to get these American volunteers. They know they're there, and they're going to pay them more than the Americans will pay in the War of 1812, by the way, so that's why a lot of these people are coming in. And they want to get the resources that they can do to win the war. So they come in with this large contingent, including the Veracruz Regiment of in Mexico with a guy named Lieutenant Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. This is the first time Santa Anna is going to come into Texas as a 19-year-old lieutenant. They're going to fight the crucial Battle of Medina. This is south of San Antonio. We don't actually know the exact location. There are lots of people looking for it. There's some great stuff out there. There's a podcast on it I recommend highly. Roughly, there's San Antonio. Here's the Medina and San Antonio River intersection. The Republican Army is probably around here somewhere along the river or just south of it. The Spanish are going to come in. They're going to attack. They're going to march into this Republican ambush. The Republicans are hit them and push them back. Now, based on all the battles they've seen, this is the victory strategy. This is how you win. You get the enemy on the run. The problem is this is a ploy. This is a royalist probe. It's not their actual army in the march. They're being chased back, but they're on horseback. So they can get away in ways that infantry can't. The rebels don't really appreciate this, so they keep pursuing, and they're going to pursue directly into a Spanish trap. The Spanish will have an ambush several miles, we don't know the exact location, south of the original Republican position, and they will have a hard-fought battle for a couple of hours. This comes real close to being won by either side. And this is a crucial point because all the history of Texas would have changed if this had happened. Texas would have been independent, essentially, for a long time, and it would have been independent, kind of hanging out there by itself, maybe for 10 years, while the rest of Mexico gets organized. All sorts of different alternative scenarios of history can come out of that. So the Spanish are going to push them back. Again, this is going to be like those other battles, Rosillo and Alazan, in reverse. It's now the rebels who are getting wiped out. 1,000 to 1,100 rebels, mostly Anglo-Americans, are killed on the battlefield. What you're going to see is the Anglo-Americans are all on foot, so they're going to get killed in the actual battle. Later on, the Tejanos who get to San Antonio are going to have a harder time, but there's either way, both contingents of the Republican Army are going to suffer greatly. The Spanish lose about 700, according to my estimation. They claim a lot less, but we know that that's not true. They're going to be chasing the rebels all the way to Nacogdoches. When they take San Antonio, remember, they've said all these horrible things they're going to do in San Antonio. And General Arredondo has a history. He's proven in other parts of Mexico where he's fought how bad he can be. And he's basically treating them like conquered Indians. They're not Spanish subjects anymore. They've lost that right by rebelling. So he's got to put the town to fire and sword, and nothing will remain of it but ruins. So it's a miracle that the city of San Antonio even exists today. The refugees are going to get to San Antonio. They don't have a chance to fight. The Alamo is not the fortress we think of it. And besides, the Tejano contingent is not going to go hide in the Alamo while their families are getting killed by the Spanish army. So they're going to flee. A lot of them are going to flee up the Camino Real towards Louisiana. Some of the Spanish refugees are going to spend 10 years in the United States before coming back. So that changes a lot of their mentality and understanding about their American neighbors. It's going to be a brutal thing for the people who remain. They will call it La Noche Triste, which means the night of sorrows. These horrible things, and I made the mistake one time of reading this while my 12-year-old son was in the audience. He was horrified by that, so I'll let you read it if you want. But it's brutal things that happen in San Antonio when the Spanish come in. In the Tejano men, and here's where it becomes the Tejanos suffering more, because at the battlefield, the Americans were suffering greatly. But once they get to San Antonio, they just keep on going. The Tejano men have to come and grab their families. So it takes them a lot longer to flee, so a lot more of them are captured. And it's their town. Some of them don't want to leave. But the men are put in this granary, and granaries at the time, they're specifically built to be airless. You don't want vermin, you don't want rats, you don't want anything getting in. So you put 700 men in a building probably half the size of this room, and it's going to be a bad circumstance. A lot of them die. The ones who survive are pulled out, revived, and then taken around the corner and shot. It's going to be a brutal conquest of San Antonio. The women are put in this terrible place, again, maybe about half the size of this room, called La Quinta. It's a house, basically. And the term La Quinta is a euphemism. It's an ironic moniker because a quinta is like a resort or a nice place. That's why the hotel chain calls itself that. And of course, the Spanish are using this in an ironic term because it's a brutal place where these women are brutalized and forced to make food for the Spanish army. So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of the revolution. Why this matters. It's not just a flash in the pan. This thing happened, it's great, but we need to know why it's relevant to Texas history today. First of all, it's the end of Spanish Texas. It's not just that Spain just kind of faded away. The end of Spanish Texas came in a flash. This horrible war, which destroys the population of Texas. 1/3 of the population of Texas is killed or exiled in a span of 2 weeks. They're gone. Eventually, we can't track exactly who's dying, who's living, but when we look at the population numbers, it's clear about 1/3 of them are gone, and maybe half again of those will come back as, they were the exiles who they eventually get pardons and they come back. The rest are likely dead. So two of the key towns in Texas are destroyed, Trinidad and San Marcos. The modern San Marcos is a couple miles up the river from the one of that time. Nacogdoches went from about 700 people to 3, and it was basically completely abandoned. This is going to come to play in Texas history later on when Anglo-Americans come in and say, oh, free land. And then later on, these Spanish people I have the claim to this, and the Anglos are like, well, there's no way here. Well, it's because of this. When Stephen F. Austin comes into Texas in a few years, he's going to call it a howling wilderness. It wasn't until this war. The war is what made it the wilderness. The war is what set up the destruction of the Spanish population in Texas. Again, the Tejanos, many of them are going to go into exile in Louisiana. Jose Francisco Ruiz spends 9 years in the United States, knows the American population really well. That becomes a key event, a key thing in 1836. And the most important factor is the Spanish realize what they've done. They've now conquered Texas, but if they just remove all the people, who gets it? It's going to be the Comanches. They need people in Texas, and they need them right away. And General Arredondo, the guy who does this, within a couple of years realizes, what have I done? I've denuded the population. I've got to get people in. And that's when Moses Austin comes in 1820 and says, have I got a deal for you? I can bring settlers. And Arredondo's looking at Mexico. There's nobody in Mexico in the middle of a revolution who's going to move to Texas. It's like, yeah, I'll take it. It's the only deal I can get. So you're going to see a lot of these people, as Texas is settled in the 1820s, a lot of these veterans of this army are going to settle in Texas. Some of them are going to be, most of them are kind of obscure people. There was one guy named Goodwin Brown Cotton. In 1813, he edits the Gaceta de Texas, which is the newspaper of the Revolution. In 1829, he's going to start the Texas Gazette. It's the same paper, just revived. But of course, it's going to be different because the population is evolving far more large number of Anglos compared to the Tejanos at this point. But he's going to be the next door neighbor to this guy named William Barrett Travis. So when William Barrett Travis is at the Alamo writing his victory or death letter, he knows what victory or death means because he's been next door neighbors for 8 years with this guy who fought at the Battle of Medina. A lot of these people are going to influence the people of Texas in their 1836 struggle. Some of them are going to show up. Juan Davis Bradburn, kind of the bad guy of the 1836 revolution, he's going to show up in this time period. And some of them will actually fight. Most of it's a generational thing, so most of it's their children fighting. But you'll have a couple people who are involved in the revolution. 2 guys who were on the scene for the first Declaration of Independence, James Gaines and Jose Francisco Ruiz, will be among the signers of the 1836 Declaration of Independence. The Texas Secretary of War was one of the rebel officers in the first revolution. There's Tejanos who fought in the revolution as well. Juan Martin Veramindi, one of these Tejano noble or upper class Tejanos, is one of those people who spent time in exile. So he gets to know Jim Bowie long before Jim Bowie comes and wants to marry his daughter in the 1830s. So there are all these connections between these 2 groups. More commonly, it's their children who are fighting, like I said. There's 2 Alamo defenders who are descendants of 1811 to 13 veterans. William Philip King is one of them. Charles Despalier is a really fascinating story. Despalier is he's a son of one veteran of 1813 and grandson of another. His grandfather, a guy named Luis Grande, who's a Tejano, he's captured as the rebel courier bringing secret propaganda to the city of San Antonio, and he's executed in the Alamo. Let's fast forward 25 years later, his grandson is probably killed within yards of where he was killed. And that to me it's powerful. This is a 3-generation fight for liberty in Texas. Charles Despalier, interestingly enough, is on the Alamo Cenotaph twice. I've got another article coming out in next year on this. Because he's half French and half Tejano, he actually has like a dual identity, and the Tejanos remember as Carlos Espalier, and the Americans remember as Charles Despalier. He's on the cenotaph under both names, but it's the same guy. Again, there's other people. I won't go into all the details. It's all in the book. There's Albert Sidney Johnson, famous person in Texas history, Civil War history. He had 2 older brothers who fought in the war, and there's just more. There's lots of them. So why is this important? And it's not just a interesting tale that we tell people. Oh, by the way, this happened. It's been treated as a footnote in Texas history, but it's actually crucial. And I liken it to the relationship between World War I and World War II. You cannot understand how World War II came about if you don't know that World War I existed. This is the World War I of Texas history. This first revolution sets up all the chain of events that will set up the second revolution. It changes the perspective that we look at the people who came to Texas and why, because it's a generational difference. In 1812, the War of 1812 is really what creates American unity and American nationalism, the way we think of it today. In 1811 and early 1812, when these people show up, they're just as likely to, create a new country, become Mexicans. They're not so tied, especially the ones who have the Aaron Burr legacy. They're not so tied to being Americans. It's a different generational idea of what America is. And they're certainly not Southern nationalists. They're just as likely to be from Connecticut or New York in this revolution as from Tennessee or Georgia. So it's a really interesting way to look at how the people are evolving. And it really tells us a lot more about history. It's a lot more complex and deep than we realize. And that's why I like to say this is the most important forgotten event in Texas history. And not just Texas history, but American history. There's no other war in American history that has this much as a percentage of population devastation and destruction. And of course, it sets up this whole chain of events that over the next 30, 40 years will turn Texas from being a Spanish province to an American piece of the United States. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
On an early slide, you had the word rat line or rat line.
Yeah, so that's like a supply line for like an insurgent group. It's basically a supply line that they get their medical supplies, their ammunition, all the things that they need to run their insurgency.
Any idea why they call it that?
No, just because it's just something that they've used in insurgency speak, basically. Yes, question.
The administration in Washington, were they just silent on all this? Did they have a position?
So their official state position was that they did not support it, but they're really late in responding to everything. There's a 2-month distance to send a letter from Texas to Washington. And to get a response back, it's basically 4.5 months. So this kicks off, and it does deliberately so within a week or two of the word arriving in Louisiana of the War of 1812. The theory among the frontiersmen is because Spain and England are allies, once we declare war on England, that's going to mean war with Spain. So what they're doing is illegal, but they think it'll be legal. That'll be fixed real quick once Spain declares war on us. Spain never does. And that's really a key thing because that is essentially makes this revolution stillborn. There were lots of more people who were going to flock to this cause. But the first thing the government does is it says, we don't support this, and you can't skip your militia duty. We're declaring war on England. You can't just go to the frontier and fight this other war. But the Americans are expansionists generally. They're much more interested in seizing land in Canada. Canada is the prize of the War of 1812 that they think that they're going to get. So the people in the United States government, that's their focus. They think this is a tiny army. They don't even give it much hope for success. And the fact that they almost do is pretty astounding. But it's in the course of the War of 1812, the Madison administration is going to be so overwhelmed. At one point, the Secretary of State is James Monroe. He's also going to take over the job of Secretary of War because the Secretary of War is incompetent. So he fires him. He takes over the job of Secretary of War. And as the British Army is marching towards Washington, he goes out there on horseback and scouts for the Army. That's not the job of the Secretary of State to go scout for the Army, but they're micromanagers. They're so focused on that war that this is just a sideshow to them. And they can't put in the effort it takes to actually try to do anything about it. And of course, Spain believes it's duplicitous, as I would if I was Spanish too. Yes?
James Gaines was involved in this.
Yes.
The same guy that ran the ferry crossing from Sabine.
Yes.
I'm curious whether when Aaron Burr was chasing everyone eastward, if they used his ferry to get back across the river.
They almost certainly did. So at the time it was called Crow's Ferry. There's a guy named Miguel Crow. He's Michael Crow. He's an American who's a legal Spanish resident. So he's running that ferry. It's a key event. That's where some of the key events of the early revolution start. And after the war, after the revolution is over, Crow will still be there, but he's older, so he sells it to James Gaines, and that's the same ferry. Yes. All right, yes.
About this time, New Orleans is getting to be a very uncomfortable place for your Lafitte, and they were trying to think about that.
Yes.
Did they show up in the story at all?
Yeah, so they'll show up shortly after, because what happens is the Lafitte's are very closely connected with the Mexican cause. Of course, any cause that has opportunity to make money, they're gonna be involved in. There's a couple of Lafitte's in this army. The Lafitte family is really big. I tried to connect them, but they're like third cousins or something. But there are definitely, after this fails, a lot of people are gonna realize how close they came. They literally came within 15 minutes of winning all of Texas. And that's what inspires James Long and all these other people. They're like, oh, it was so close. And the rebels actually within the next year will try to piece it together. But what happens is when England lands to invade New Orleans, everyone on the frontier says this is the bigger fight because New Orleans is the prize, the real prize. And with New Orleans threatened, they all forget about Texas. And literally the survivors, Anglo and Tejano alike, they're Tejanos who fight at New Orleans, at the Battle of New Orleans. They all join that cause, they fight that, and then afterwards, after the war's over, they try to piece this together. But by that point, the U.S. government is a lot better at shutting these things down. You go into New Orleans and try to recruit, they will shut you down. And so it becomes harder to do that. And even when Long does it, it's just kind of a small army. And what's interesting is you'll notice all the filibusters that occur, with one exception, are against Spain. There's only one filibuster against Mexico. And that's a key distinction because they believe in this Republican ideology, whether they seriously completely agree or if it's kind of the cover for their other agenda. They're going to support Mexico against Spain, but when it's a fight against Mexico, which is technically a republic, they can't get all the support in the United States for that cause. And the one that's going to happen is the Fredonians, and that has totally different causes, and that's a whole different topic. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate all your time, and thank you all for those who've been watching online, and I'll be happy to visit with you guys and sign books if anyone wants any. Thank you all.